In 1993, many of us received in the mail a letter from the San Francisco Police Department informing us that our personal information had been found in the files of the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, the ADL. As a result of this illegal spying activity, the ADL faced litigation on several fronts, not the least of which was a class action suit in which our next speaker plays a major role. Pete McCloskey is no stranger to the ADL's strong-arm tactics. As a Republican congressman in California, he was targeted by Jewish Zionist organizations for speaking out against Israel's illegal use of American-made cluster bombs in Lebanon. As you might guess, of anyone bold enough to stand up to the Israeli lobby, Pete McCloskey is one tough character. As a U.S. Marine in the Korean conflict, he was awarded the Navy Cross as a second lieutenant, the Silver Star, and a Purple Heart. He graduated from Stanford University and later received a law degree from Stanford Law School. As a congressman, he was the first Republican to speak out against the Vietnam War, as well as the first to give a speech calling for the impeachment of President Richard Nixon. He's here tonight to share with us, from hard-won experience, how the ADL operates. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm IHR welcome to Congressman Pete McCloskey.
You might wonder why a man would leave Northern California and come to Southern California in the middle of a lovely weekend. I came because I respect the thesis of this organization. And the thesis being that there should be a re-examination of whatever governments say or politicians say or political entities may say. I was in politics for 15 years, and I think you would start with the assumption, never trust a politician. I was on active duty in the Marine Corps over at Camp Pendleton, a few miles from here. In 1964, I was the supposedly leading Marine Corps reserve officer studying counterinsurgency. I was running the counterinsurgency school for Marine Reserve officers for a month. And during the time that I was at Pendleton, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution was enacted by the Congress. And you may remember that the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, came before the Congress and said that torpedo boats had attacked for the second time two destroyers, the Maddox and the Turner Joy. The Congress voted nearly unanimously to authorize the President to go to war in Vietnam, one of the most tragic mistakes that we ever made. The two men I fought under in Korea, General MacArthur, General Ridgway, both said, never again fight a land war on the Asian continent. It is not a place for American firepower, mobility, and concern over human life is a place to wage war. Nevertheless, we went to war, and a great American who stands for exactly what your thesis is, Senator Fulbright, said it is the responsibility of the politician to lead in the re-examination both of policy and in historical fact. Because if you're going to make policy decisions, you need to know what the facts are. You may remember when President Lyndon Johnson resigned rather than run again for the presidency of the United States. Lyndon Johnson had told everyone in the Congress for some years that he knew we were doing the right thing. We had to bring the coonskin home in Vietnam because we couldn't afford to be, as Nixon had said, a pitiful, humble giant. We had to win that war. And every morning he got briefed by the CIA and the Defense Department, the State Department, the fact, and he was convinced we were winning the war. Well, one of the friends that I had in law school, my debate partner in the moot court debates at Stanford Law School in 1950 was John Ehrlichman. And I asked John, when he went to prison in 1975, what had caused him to become a corrupt servant to President Nixon, lie to the Congress. What had caused a fine, honest lawyer to become corrupt? And I asked him why Henry Kissinger had been making the foreign policy of the United States rather than the Secretary of State, William Rogers, who by law was entrusted with that responsibility. And he said, Pete, it's this way. When Richard Nixon every morning at 7 o'clock gets his briefing of the events around the world, there's a briefing from State, Defense, and the CIA. However, we can't trust any of those three agencies because their warfare amongst themselves are greater than their desire to tell the truth to the President of the United States. Therefore, Kissinger is the censor of those three reports. He takes State, Defense, and the CIA and interprets so that the President gets a single briefing from Henry Kissinger. Well, you can imagine what that could do to the policy of the United States, Kissinger's policy being what they were. Before I get to the Anti-Defamation League, though, I was struck in listening to the speeches today of the courage of the men who in France and Britain, Germany, New Zealand have spoken out against the commonly accepted concept of what occurred during World War II and the so-called Holocaust. And I wanted to tell you a story that every American ought to know, because we do have free speech in this country, and we have a judicial system with the right to jury trial. And whatever you may think of the ability of given judges or the ability of given members of the press and the independent judiciary have saved us from the kind of thing that have been described today in Germany or Britain or Canada. Britain and Canada have the Official Secrets Act. New Zealand, I remember going down to New Zealand one time, there were 100 members of the New Zealand legislature. And a radio talk show host had commented that, and some statistic, that 4% of the men in New Zealand were homosexual. That meant that in the New Zealand Parliament there might be 4 homosexuals. Well, they held him up in front of a committee of the New Zealand Parliament and threatened him with locking him up and throw away the key for contempt of the Parliament, which you could do in New Zealand, allegedly. Well, he whined and whimpered and said, well, I didn't mean to say 4 members of the Parliament are homosexual, but it's just the statistics, and if they properly represent the people of New Zealand, there would be 4 that are homosexual. Well, with his apology and humble, they let him go. Within 6 months, 3 members of the New Zealand Parliament had admitted they were homosexual. But the difference in America, how many of you know the story of John Peter Zenger?
Yes.
If you re-examine history, you go back to about the time George Washington was born in 1732, and we had a royal governor of the colony of New York named Cosby, and a very brave editor, maybe the David McCalder or the Mark Webber of his time, came out and said, Cosby is corrupt. He's taking money from the royal treasury. The government is corrupt, and the governor is corrupt. And they hauled him up for trial, and we had carried over the common law of England. We had the right to jury trial. And the Chief Justice, Delaney, instructed the jury, 12 men tried and true, you must find John Peter Zenger guilty because he has criticized the government. It is important and essential to the preservation of government that people have a good opinion of it. Therefore, you must find him guilty. Well, the jury took about 20 minutes. They acquitted John Peter Zenger. As a result, when we adopted our Bill of Rights, we put into it 2 essential rights, the right of free speech, free press, and the right of trial by jury. And that has generally protected people of whatever dissenting views in this country they cared to express from everything except the scorn of their peers in the same field. I may not agree with you on everything that I've heard today or what you may feel, but your right to say what you believe and to research facts which are allegedly true and to try to disprove them is perhaps the most important part of our democracy. And the fact that you're protected by the rights of free speech, the constitutional rights, and you ultimately have a trial to jury, that's what we're up against with the ADL now, and I think ultimately we're going to win. But when you think of those rights that they don't have in Canada or Great Britain or New Zealand or France or Germany, where people can go to jail for expressing unpopular thoughts, thank God we're Americans. Maybe thank God for the privilege of being American. Right at the moment, I'm on a group of people that are revisiting an event of 50 years ago. The alleged massacre of anywhere between 15 to 300 Korean civilians, women and children, under a bridge by the 7th Cavalry Regiment, famous for the Battle of the Little Bighorn under George Armstrong Custer. And we're interviewing people, and the Army is making an enormous investigation. This is the 50th anniversary of the Korean War. And thus far, in 105 interviews, we are getting conflicting stories, to the point where if you were to write the true history of what happened under this bridge, you would have to say there is evidence for and there is evidence against, and the credibility of the witnesses is very much important, and the memories after 50 years can be false. And people who, after wars, tend to build up their military records. One of the chief witnesses who, yes, I machine gunned several hundred people, has now been accused that he didn't get a battlefield commission, he wasn't in the unit, and he wasn't wounded, and he wasn't captured by the enemy. All things that he has written into his record as history. He became the president of the 7th Cavalry Association. So right at the moment, if you were to ask anyone, well, what is the truth of what happened 50 years ago? The finest investigative talent in the Army, which doesn't necessarily want to discredit the famous 7th Cavalry, the finest people that can give it an independent review, people like Don Oberdorf or the Washington Post, we can't tell you at this point until we have heard all of the evidence, and even then we may not be able to tell you what the complete truth is. But massacres tend to get covered up, just as massacres tend to be accelerated. The Boston Massacre, what were there, 8 people killed in Boston, and yet the rebellion against the United States, against Great Britain, stemmed from the so-called Boston Massacre. I was struck by a book, and I commend it to you all as historians, called The Mountain Meadows Massacre. It was published in 1950 and disclosed a massacre by members of the Mormon Church south of Cedar City, Utah, in the year 1857. Remember, the Mormons had been driven out of Illinois and Missouri by people who thought they were religious fanatics or cultists. They had no love for the people in Missouri and Illinois who had driven them out. Brigham Young had founded Salt Lake City and had sent people south, as far south here as San Bernardino and into southern Utah. And a little town called Cedar City, which was trying to defend itself against the Paiutes and the Navajo Indians, embattled. A wagon train came through on the way to Los Angeles in the year 1857, 150 men, women, and children, about 20 of the children being under 2 years of old, some having been born on the long trek from Missouri. When they passed through Cedar City, the Mormons didn't much like it. They had suffered at the hands of Missourians a few years earlier. And so as the wagon train moved south, it moved to a place called the Mountain Meadows, which was the last good grass for their horses and their cattle before they crossed down into the desert to pass Death Valley on the way to Los Angeles. They were surrounded by Indians, and they drew the wagons in a circle, and for 3 days they held the Indians off. And the story came down that for 90 years it was believed that the Indians had massacred that wagon train. A young Mormon woman, a Latter-day Saint, had heard rumors from relatives and friends. He started collecting diary entries, went to people and got their correspondence. Finally developed the thesis that the Mormons had treacherously responded to the Indians by luring the 150 people out of the wagon train to give them safe conduct back to Cedar City, leaving their weapons behind. That the Mormons, facing a threat that the Indians would come after them if they didn't help them, as the column moved out a half mile and the men were in the van, each Mormon did a left face, leveled his rifle, and killed the member of the wagon train to his left. Some of the men shot into the air, as is alleged to have happened in Korea 50 years ago, but then the Indians rushed it out of the brush and massacred everyone except 20 children. That story was suppressed by the Mormon Church, the people of Utah. It was never told for 93 years, from 1857 until 1950. And this lady published her book. She was threatened with death. She was deemed not a good Mormon, a terrible, lying person, to bring history 93 years forward that disclosed that the Mormon Church had covered up a massacre in which they were not only complicitous, they'd been guilty of treachery. So no one should trust the history, the common belief of what happened in any given year. Now let me go back a little to the question of the ADL. I've told you that in 1964 I was on active duty in the Marine Corps. I was elected to Congress in 1969. or 67, I was a Marine Corps Lieutenant Colonel. And in the spring of 1969, a lot of young Republican congressmen were distressed by the war. We were distressed because Nixon had been elected with a plan to end the war. The war was still going on. People were being killed in countless numbers for a cause that we weren't sure we should be fighting in a country where clearly we weren't winning. Friends of mine in the Marine Corps said, "Pete, we can't win that war." In any event, in the spring of 1959, 22 Republican congressmen under the direction of Bill Brock. Bill Brock was Congressman Tennessee, Republican. He said, "Let's go out on the campuses and try to report back to the President of the United States what's going on the campuses." Three of us, Jerry Pettis of San Bernardino, Don Regal, a Republican of Michigan, and I came to California. George Bush, I think, went to SMU and University of Texas, Texas A&M. And we dressed like students. We wore Levi's and T-shirts and acted like we were part of the student body. When we got to Berkeley, we were tear gassed by the sheriff's office, which was putting down a riot. The National Guard fixed bayonets, marched on us. We fled up one of the main streets of Berkeley. And running along the street, a gray-haired professor was running alongside of me. And a man, they were beating people in the streets with clubs, opponents of the war. The man was running alongside, a nice beard, saying, "Oink, oink, 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 oink." And the professor next to me said, "He has a message. Listen. No matter how a message may be outrageous to people, a man running along saying, 'Oink, oink, oink, oink,' we should listen, because out of the mouths of babes and swine and people who dissent come truths that we accept 20 or 30 or 40 years later." You only have to look at McNamara, Robert McNamara, the chief architect of the Vietnam War, who, when he wrote his book, I hope you've read it, called In Retrospect, is it? He said, "You know, every decision I made, I got the best advice from the most knowledgeable people. I listened to all of the advice. I never made a decision until I was sure I was right, and then I made the decision." And of course, he made the decision to urge Lyndon Johnson to send troops to Vietnam. When he was 80 years old, he wrote a book and said, "You know, I was dead wrong in Vietnam. We didn't have a clue how the Vietnamese thought. We didn't have any American experts on the history of Vietnam." So revisionism, rethinking history, there isn't an item in history, in my judgment, that doesn't deserve research and inquiry. But let me go to the ADL, and this speech was supposed to be entitled "Machinations of the ADL." I'll tell you a little about my experience. I'm a fourth-generation Californian. My both grandfathers were lawyers here in Southern California. I grew up in a little town called San Marino, a classic all-white suburb. Last I heard, there were 9,000 voters, 8,700 of them were Republicans. There were no blacks in San Marino, and there were no Jews, because they kept Jews out of San Marino by asking, "What's the maiden name of your mother?" The real estate people had a conspiracy. Jews in your neighborhood were supposed to drop property values just like blacks. My father was a member of a law firm called Horwitz and McCloskey. Practiced downtown Spring Street when that was the head of the legal profession. I remember once when I was a boy, he said, "Son," he said, "we Irish need the Jews." He said, "We have half of the good traits of mankind and half of the bad ones, and they're exactly opposite. They got the good traits where we're weak, and they have the weak traits where we're strong." And I remembered that, but in 1960, I was the president of the Palo Alto Bar Association, and next year I was elected president of the California Conference of Barristers. That's all lawyers in the state under 36 years of age. And that year there was a proposition that came on the California ballot. Some of you may remember it as Proposition 14. And Proposition 14 read very simply: a person should have the right to sell or rent his home to whomever he chooses. Sounds good. What that means is a person should be free to discriminate against anybody that he doesn't like because of race or some other reason. And the Bar Convention that year had never taken a position in political efforts, but we felt, since we were constitutional lawyers and that this was clearly unconstitutional, the bar ought to speak out. And we got a lawyer in his late 70s named Herman Sylvan. He was a tax lawyer with a famous Jewish firm in Los Angeles called Loeb and Loeb. And Herman Sylvan got up and made the concluding speech. I spoke, three of us spoke, that the bar ought to take a position on this matter of constitutional interest. And Herman Sylvan made a marvelous speech, very persuasive. At the end, he said, "We lawyers have shown we've got great minds, we've got great hearts. Now let's show we have some guts." And the bar convention, 3,000 people voted 2-1 to take a position against Proposition 14. It was useless. The people of California voted 2-1 to pass Proposition 14, whereupon it was held unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. In any event, we took Herman Sylvan out for a beer later, complimented him, as young lawyers will to an elderly sage. And he said, well, yes, he said he had his heart in it, but he had to tell us that anti-Semitism was alive and well. That a friend of his has invited him to the Montecito Country Club in Santa Clara, in Santa Barbara, famous country club, wealthy. When they got to the door, there was a man at the tuxedo. He's looking down the list. He says, "Sullivan, we don't take Jews here." Now that's 1963. This state, in my lifetime, had a long record of anti-Semitism. And what do people do when they're discriminated against? They form networks. There should be a German-American network today. Do you realize that the largest ethnic minority in this country are Germans? Over 50 million Germans, but since World War I, World War II, I know of no German-American organization willing to say, "I'm a German-American." Anybody knows a German? I know of German societies that help other Germans that are impoverished and are in need, but they do it quietly, with no pride, that I'm a German-American.
There is one called the German-American Verband, and the president told me we make no waves.
Well, I was about to say that, because do you guys ever run into a department store named Mervyn's Department Store? Big clothing all over the country, all over shopping centers. Mervyn Morris, who was the chief executive officer, was a constituent of mine when I was first elected. Typical liberal Jewish leader. When I came out against giving military aid to Israel, Merv Morris, who had become a pillar of the ADL, said, "Pete, I grew up as a Californian with my mother telling me every morning, Mervyn, whatever you think, don't make waves. If Jews make waves, bad things will occur, anti-Semitism, things of that nature." So prior to 1967, the Jewish communities in America had built up a network of mutual support in the synagogues and the Jewish community centers. And there were 33 major Jewish organizations by 1967 when the Six-Day War occurred. And the B'nai B'rith, which had been in existence since the beginning of the century and had stood for anti-bigotry and anti-Semitism, stopped the desecration of synagogues, perfectly valid society. The Anti-Defamation League, which had remained silent when the word began to come of whatever was happening, Germany was happening. The ADL became the most militant voice for Israel. And the creation of the Jewish state caused the Jewish leaders, and to try to get 20 or 30 of each leading citizen, each city in the United States, to be a good Jew meant that you had to support Israel. And I think probably the title Israel über alles, or Israel above all, became the watchword of the ADL. And they built up, starting in 1965 or thereabouts, an intelligence organization where, to learn their enemies, people like Roy Bullock, who masqueraded as a kind of rotund antique dealer, first in the Midwest in Indiana, then he moved to Los Angeles, then to San Francisco. He would pass himself off as a sympathizer with whatever group was deemed by the ADL to be hostile to the state of Israel. And the purpose of the ADL, from trying to stop anti-Semitism and bigotry, by the 1980s had become to discredit any voice that was hostile to the policies of Israel, to cooperate with the demands of Israel, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not. But the network that was built up prior to 1967 went into full gear under the ADL after the Six-Day War, not only to discredit people who spoke out against Israel, but to deny them forums. I heard one of your speakers say he was denied a debate. I've debated nearly everybody. I've debated Meir Kahan in front of 2,000 Jews in San Francisco. I've debated Jerry Rubin of the JDL. No ADL leader will debate me on the subject of Israel. I've forgotten who the speaker was that then they offered $250,000 or $500 million if the ADL makes a conscious choice. If there is a skilled debater or a skilled scholar on the other side, they won't debate. If KQED or a public television station wants to have a debate in the Mideast, they'll call the ADL first, who speaks for the Jewish community. They'll call whoever is on the other side. I'm president of a group called Americans for the National Interest. Paul Finley and I founded that organization a few years ago. Some of you may be members of it. All we're trying to do is to get an equal voice with the Israeli lobby. But when they call the ADL and they say, would you debate Mr. McCloskey or Congressman McCloskey or Senator Percy or Senator Adlai Stevens? And no. The ADL does not want the facts to come out. They want to suppress any facts that are critical of Israel. So if you understand that that's their goal, above all else, preserve the special relationship between Israel and the United States. Preserve a good public opinion of Israel on the part of the American people so that the money keeps coming. Defeat anybody like Paul Finley or Chuck Percy or even Ed Shaw, who was defeated mainly by Jewish money here in Southern California for the Senate. You understand that their purpose is to discredit and to deny a forum to anybody. So, of course, the IHR would immediately become a large bullseye and a goal and a target of the ADL. Now, when they build up this intelligence organization, I would guess, I would be almost certain that somewhere in this room is someone who is a member of the ADL or reporting to the ADL. Because you have no way to assure that everyone who comes to this room is what he says he is. Bullock would go to the American Arab Anti-Discrimination League. He'd say, I'm in sympathy. Let me pass out your literature. Then he'd go out in the parking lot at a meeting where a group, my wife got listed. She was on a thing called Proposition W up in San Francisco, which was to cut aid to Israel by the amount of money they were putting into the settlements on the West Bank and Gaza. So she became targeted because she was taking a view hostile to Israel. When the San Francisco police first learned that, I got a call from a police captain. He said, Mr. McCloskey, in the records of the San Francisco ADL is a note that when your wife crossed from Jordan into Israel in 1987, she was involved in an altercation at the Allenby Bridge. Well, I was with her at the time, Jim Aberesk. You remember the senator from Arab American Center, North Dakota, South Dakota. We had visited Jordan. My wife wanted to go across and see Jerusalem, Jericho. Crossing the bridge, there were 5 young women in their 20s, early 30s. The Jewish border guard stopped them, and 4 of them, my wife with a name like McCloskey or Smith or Jones, no problem. One of the girls was named Aziz, an Arab name. She'd married a young Arab American. All 5 American citizens. The Israeli border guard turned to the one named Aziz and said, take off your clothes. It's a humiliating, it's a demeaning experience. My wife was offended, spoke of her offense, but to find 6 years later that to turn up in the office of the San Francisco Anti-Defamation League meant that information was coming the other way, as well as going from America to Israel. Victor Ostrovsky, of the former member of the Mossad, has written about the cooperation of the American Jewish community with the Israeli government. In the ADL's case, they wanted to ingratiate themselves with police departments so that they could get information from police departments about anti-Semitic activity or anti-Israel activity. The years that Bullock got in trouble, the ADL spy, the way he was caught, he would come to a meeting like this, he'd sit down, he'd go out in the parking lot, and he'd take the license plates of all the cars in the parking lot. And then he would take the license plate numbers. Here's a list, Tom, to the Tom Gerard of the Police Intelligence San Francisco. Would you get me the names of these people? And back would come the name and the address of the people that owned that car and a notation. These people are anti-Israel, or they're pro-Palestinian, or they're peacemakers on the war in Vietnam. And that information would then be funneled to the Los Angeles office of the ADL, to the New York office of the ADL, to the Washington, D.C., and to whatever local office was involved. Portland, Oregon might get it. The 31 major cities, including Tel Aviv, with offices of the ADL, were on constant communication. And they built up these dossiers so that if you wanted to call and find out if a person was anti-Israel or had ever said anything that was anti-Israel, you call this number, the guy on the line in Los Angeles, 30 seconds later he can come back and say no or yes, which would condemn you. Well, I had spoken out against the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, the use of cluster bombs. I had been known as a relative friend of Israel up till that time. The Jews quite often had views that I shared on issues like Vietnam or women's right of choice, things of that kind. But once I took one position that was deemed hostile to the state of Israel, I was a marked man. I came back and ran for the Senate in 1982. I'd been in the House 15 years. And let me tell you what happened. I'll give you 3 examples. My finance chairman in Southern California was a savings and loan executive. He was a very loyal man. He'd known my father. He wanted to help me. He thought I'd make a good senator. There was a savings and loan crisis in 1982, you may remember. 3 of his biggest Jewish depositors came to him and said, Mr. X, we see you're the chairman of his finance committee. You get off that committee, or we will withdraw our deposits. So now you had the coupling of economic power. Advertisers. If a radio talk show or a television talk show indicated sympathy with the Palestinian cause, the station would be deluged with calls. This man's anti-Semitic. Any comment. The threat of anti-Semitic Semitism, as you know, in the academic community, nobody wants to be called a bigot or anti-Semitic. But the ADL in this period of time, you've seen the new books, the new anti-Semitism, the real anti-Semitism. And no longer is this Jewish political, the liberal political thought of the 30s. Now the support of Israel is the primary obligation of every Jew. You're not a good Jew unless you are speaking out for Israel or doing your part to defend Israel against unjust criticism. When I left the Congress, I lost that Senate race to Pete Wilson. Pete Wilson, the Republican, went up to San Fernando Valley and made a promise to the Jewish leaders of that highly powerful Jewish area that if elected to the Senate, he would favor the annexation of the West Bank and Gaza. That story was reported and absolutely hushed up. You've never heard the story since. The Jewish community has the power to suppress, either by advertising or control of the media, stories that are hostile to Israel, and they have the ability to discredit anyone who speaks out. And that's their purpose. I'm going to give you a couple examples of what they've done to friends or clients of mine. And you'll recognize this goal to preserve a good public opinion of Israel. In 1983, 2 young women that were wives of Arab professors at San Jose State and the University of California, Carol Al-Shaib and Audrey Shabbos, had a little educational program to try to educate people about Muslim culture, Arab culture. And they would put on seminars and they would teach people about the history of the Mideast. They quickly came under the eye of the ADL as being threatening to Israel because they were speaking of justice for Palestinians. They entered into a contract when the Saudi art exhibit came to San Jose. It was going to be hosted by the San Jose Art Museum Foundation, I believe was the name of it. It was run by 21 leading citizens. The chairman happened to be Jewish. Carol and Audrey were going to put on 2 speakers, a lady from Texas who had spoken for Palestinian rights, One of the members of the board thought he'd heard the name, and he called the local ADL representative, a Professor Brenner, up at the University of California, famous professor. And Brenner said, those people are anti-Israel. The two women had invested about $5,000 to put on this sort of 4-day expression. They'd sent letters out to all school teachers. They were called up in front of the board and told them that they were going to have controversial speakers and they were going to cancel this. Well, these are two women that are going to make $15,000 off a seminar and probably pay half of $10,000 of it in expenses. But the ADL had effectively ended their ability to earn a living in teaching people about the Arab world. The second issue, I know some of you don't like Willis Carto, but I want to tell you a story. In 1967, in the Six-Day War, a ship called the USS Liberty was sailing off the coast of Egypt and Gaza. It was outside the 3-mile limit, well outside. It was a radio antenna ship. You can call it a spy ship, but it had all the modern antenna. It was like the Pueblo that was taken off Korea a few months later. It had a crew of 295 people and officers, commanded by Captain McGonigal. In the early morning of that day, they had a big American flag, and a fellow named Jim Ennis, who was a lieutenant officer of the deck, ran up the big American flag, something that was so big you could see it for 5 miles. They were surveilled by a flight of Israeli jets, not once but twice. And finally, in the early afternoon, the jets roared in and strafed and machine gun, knocked out all of the antenna. Torpedo boats came out from the Israeli coast, launched a torpedo. Nearly everybody on deck was killed or wounded. Out of a crew of about 295, my recollection is that there were 35 killed, something like 194. The greatest casualties on a U.S. naval ship since the Slot at Guadalcanal. The ship started to go down. They put out lifeboats. The Israeli boats machine-gunned life rafts. They intended that there be no survivors. Oh, they said it was a terrible mistake. We really didn't see the American flag. We didn't know. Well, as people have examined the history of that, people have come forward and said, I was in the headquarters on that day. I was a Naval Reserve officer. Yeah, they knew it was the U.S. Liberty. It had a big American flag on it. They bombed it, strafed it deliberately. Well, the ship limped back to Malta. Captain McGonigal was able to save the ship, buried the dead, took the wounded, and gave the instructions that the crew was to be separated. No one person was to go to the same base. They spread them out over ships and stations all around the United States. They were awarded a Presidential Unit Citation, but they were never told about it. Captain McGonigal was later given the Congressional Medal of Honor for saving the ship, but he's the only Congressional Medal of Honor winner in history to get it at the Washington Navy Yard and not at a ceremony in the White House. That story was suppressed for years and years. Finally, Jim Ennis wrote a book called The Assault on the Liberty. Suddenly, the copies of the book started disappearing from libraries. Clearly, there was some effort afoot to keep Jim Ennis' story of the Israeli attack on the Liberty silent. Well, there's a little town up in Wisconsin, north of Milwaukee, called Grafton. And there were two old gentlemen, I got to remember their names. Grobe. Ted Grobe and marvelous. Was it Henry? In any event, Ted Grobe was one of them. The Grobe had been immigrants from Germany at the end of the last century. They'd set up a machine tool shop in the town of Grafton, which is a town of about 20,000. And when Grafton was in trouble in the Depression, the Grobes could be counted on to help out. They were good people. They were quiet people. They were German. They had taken the brunt of Germany's becoming the enemy of the United States in 1917. A lot of the German language newspapers in Wisconsin were in favor of the Kaiser. Why get into that war in favor of Britain and France? It was not our war. It didn't seem to be a war in which there was a whole lot involved for the United States until the Lusitania was stunk and public opinion turned against Germany. And Germans from that time forward were suppressed because they clearly, the Kaiser and the Huns and American over their expeditionary force. But the Groves plotted ahead. Their business was the most successful in the little town of Grafton. And in 1993, Grafton, unlike most towns, which they're letting their libraries go, and you can get video television anywhere you want, but try to find a library that's being supported politically. The good people of Grafton, it's south of Green Bay. If you've ever watched the Green Bay Packers, they're all Packers fans, decided they want to build a library, and so they called in a professional consultant. And if you ever build a YMCA or a Boy Scout thing in your school, there's a plan. You get a pro. And the pro comes in and he says, you need $2.5 million. Okay, you've got to raise the first $250,000, 1/10 of it. You've got to raise it from one person. You've got to start it off so people have hope that they can get the full $2.5 million. And so the first gift has got to be $250,000, and then ideally you get 5 gifts of $50,000. And then you go out publicly, and on the town square you have a big thermometer. And as you get closer and closer to your goal, the thermometer goes up and people get inspired, and finally you put it over the top. And the good people of Grafton said, well, how do you get that first $250,000? And the pro says, well, it's simple. You name the library after whoever gives you the $250,000. So the Grove brothers, Ted and his brother, give the first $250,000. And they proceeds, and finally, a year later, they've got the $2.5 million, and they're going to have the groundbreaking for the library, and the town citizens go to the Grove brothers, and they say, would you like it named the Ted Grove or the Melvin and Ted Grove Library or Hans? And no, these guys had been reading the Spotlight. Terrible Spotlight. Spotlight used to pillar me regularly about every third issue if McCloskey was a communist or against the war, against Nixon, you know, all of the bad things. Carter was no friend of mine editorially. But the Spotlight had picked up the story of the Liberty. And so they asked the Grove brothers, want it named the Grove Memorial Library? No, sir. We want it the USS Liberty Memorial Library. Well, all hell broke loose. The ADL went right up the wall. And they got editorials in the Milwaukee Journal, the Chicago papers. They had just dedicated the Golda Meir Library, I think, down in Chicago, but by God, this was anti-Semitic. To criticize Israel, an American ship that had 35 killed, one of them was Jewish, incidentally, in that crew, and 195 wounded, it was anti-Semitic to name a library after a U.S. ship that had been torpedoed and strafed by the Israeli. It would raise all of the things of anti-Semitism. They got about a third of the teachers of the high school to condemn naming the library the USS Liberty. They got the valedictorian, a young 17-year-old, to get up and speak in the graduation speech against naming the library the USS Liberty Library. And all of this was sponsored and thrust by the ADL because of this incredible fear that somehow there would be public opinion against Israel by raising this issue. And that's what you're up against. And I don't know whether you're right or wrong in the Holocaust, but any position where any historian takes a position against Israel is going to bring down the wrath and the concentrated both numbers and economic power that they can have to do it. I'll tell you another story about a friend of mine named Ivor Davies, Norman Davies. Norman Davies was the leading historian on Eastern Europe. He'd married his wife, had gone to the University of Krakow. Norman Davies was acknowledged throughout the world as the leading scholar, certainly one of the first two. He's one of the few guys who can write readable books. Maybe you've read his book, Europe. It was a bestseller. You don't find history books often that are bestsellers. Ostrowski had a bestseller. When Ostrowski was going to publish about what happened to the Mossad, the Israeli government tried to stop it. And the publicity trying to stop its publication, he sold 2 million copies, made Ostrowski a rich man, but he had to hide up in Canada from hit teams from the Mossad that he thought were coming to try to kill him to silence his voice. In any event, to go back to Norman Davies, I had just gotten out of Congress. I'd returned to the practice law in Palo Alto. It was a country town when I left it. Now it's kind of the headquarters of Silicon Valley and the economy driving the nation. And I'd been invited to be a guest professor at Stanford, teach a course on political science, 20 years history, starting the Gulf of Tonkin in '64 to the budget battles of the Reagan administration. And the ADL and a campus group called Hillel said, we can't have McCloskey teaching this course. They tried, but I'd already had a contract with the university through the student board to teach this course that spring quarter. Well, they had an election for the board, and suddenly out of 9 people who had voted 8-1 to have me speak, they had a Jewish majority and 1 Israeli on the board, and they said, silence him, don't let him speak. Tried to censor. It was a big cause celeb. And finally, the president of Stanford came out and said, you're denying academic freedom to Professor McCloskey, and they were criticized. Well, about this time, Ivor Davies came to see me. He had been brought to Stanford for a year to see if the students, he was teaching then at the University of London, he's at Oxford now, see if the students liked him. The undergraduates loved him. He taught 2 undergraduate courses. He said this is the finest guy. He was witty, he was funny, he could talk about the Russians, the Bulgarians, the Hungarians, the Poles. The graduate students thought he was the finest thing. Graduate students were adhering to him to try to study Eastern Europe under his thesis. It was assumed that at the end of the year he would come up for appointment to the Vucinich Chair of Eastern European History. Vucinich had retired. This chair was a highly endowed chair. If you got it, it was for life, something like $1 million endowment. And Davies was scheduled to be named. And Stanford has a process where the history department votes on whether or not to give this chair. So after the dean, I've seen the name Craig. He's one of your people that's spoken out for, I think, the revision concepts. The president and the emeritus at Stanford all thought that we were getting the best person in the world to teach at this school. Stanford only accepts from the top 1 or 2 in the nation. To be appointed as a teacher at Stanford or a professor, you have to be one of the top 2 in your field at your level. And this was the absolute highest level. They consulted 25 what they call outside referees. They asked, what do you think of Davies and his books? All 25 unanimously said, of the 5 people you might consider around the world for this chair, there are 2 that are head and shoulders above the other 3, and Davies is head and shoulders above the other one. 10 days before the vote was to come in December, I think it was 1983, a history professor who was a member of the ADL contacted the ADL organization in San Francisco, and the word came back to all of the Jewish members of the faculty, have you read Davies' chapter on Poland? I mean, on the Jews in Poland. You can't write a book about Poland without the situation of the Jews in Poland, where the pogroms and the Russian czars and beyond the pale and all of the history of Jews in Poland. Davies' chapter on the Jews had dared suggest that not all Poles were anti-Semitic. And that ran counter to the view of history held by the Israelis and the Jewish community around the United States that all Jews in Poland were discriminated against by the Poles who were anti-Semitic. Well, I've talked to a lot of Poles over the years, and I've found people that didn't like Jews, and I found people that helped Jews. If you helped Jews in Poland, you're going to get shot if the Nazis caught you at it. So it wasn't really easy to be pro-Jewish when you were in occupied Poland, whether the Russians or the Germans. In any event, Davies' chapter was deemed by the ADL to be hostile to Israel because of the simple suggestion that not all Poles were anti-Semitic. Well, we took him on in a lawsuit later. We lost the case on appeal, but we had a famous psychiatrist examine Davis's comments. In 52 occasions, he had spoken of Jews, and in 52 occasions, he'd spoken of Poles. And the psychologist used words like, if you talked like a greedy Jew, that was anti-Semitic. A thoughtful Jew, that was pro-Israel or pro-Jewish. If you had a vicious Pole or a kind Pole, of those 52 references, in each case, they came down 26 to 26. You would infer 26 favorable to the Poles and 26 critical, 26 favorable to the Jews, 26 critical. But to the ADL, that wasn't enough. Now, the history professors, not all of them come to every vote. And of the 38 professors, they circulated amongst the 13 Jewish professors, be there for the vote. The vote was held, the vote was 13 to 12 to deny that chair to Ivor Davies. So he does not have a platform in this state. The Jews were happy, the ADL was happy. They had prevented a forum from a voice that spoke out for reason and spoke out for a different view of history. If you've read, there was a Jewish, I think she's died now, Lucy Davidovitz. Anybody heard that name? She wrote out of New York that, in effect, Norman Davies was a revisionist, that his view of the history of Europe was detrimental to the Jewish community around the world. Well, what happened to the ADL? They got caught in a funny deal. Bullock, spying on every American from my wife, if Mills College held a seminar in the Mideast, he was there to make sure that nobody was speaking against Israel, and if they did speak in favor of the Palestinians or against Israel, the name went on his list, the license plate, the thing get funneled around so that a dossier is in his name or her name all over the ADL offices in the United States, available only to the ADL. But if you'll remember, back in the late 1980s, Israel had an ally, a fellow pariah in the international community named South Africa. And South Africa was not adhering to the United Nations resolution on Namibia, which they were supposed to give up. And Israel was not adhering to resolutions of the United Nations 242 and 338, which spoke, if there were going to be an Israeli state, there would be an equality for the Palestinian state. That's the way you infer them. Israel didn't want to give up the occupied territories. It was in violation. There's pretty good evidence that the Israeli nuclear weapons were tested by the South Africans. The diamonds that you can pick up the television tonight and read about the jewelry exchange, where do those diamonds come from? South Africa to Antwerp to here, where you can bet that much of the jewelry and diamond industry is based on South African diamonds. Well, Bullock and the ADL started looking at groups that were against apartheid in South Africa. Well, there were a lot of nice American ladies that thought that it was time to end apartheid in South Africa, and so there were women all over the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles that thought apartheid is a bad thing. Well, Bullock starts going to their meetings. And so suddenly you have the ADL not only developing intelligence on people hostile to Israel, but people that are hostile to the Boer, the Smuts, Botha governments in South Africa. And what happened next was the South African intelligence people came out to see Mr. Bullock of the ADL, and they came out to see Officer Gerard, and they had lunch, and they said, you know, we'd pay you money if you can get us information about the people in the United States that are against apartheid in South Africa. So Bullock and Gerard collected, I think, $16,000, sent 27 reports to the South African Intelligence Agency about Americans taking a political position under a free peace position, whether you agree with them or not. But because they're against South Africa, they must be against Israel. And if you're against the Jewish state, you're against Jews, and that's the definition, Mr. Perlmutter and some of those fellows, that's the new anti-Semitism. Well, about that time, the U.S. FBI got the word that South Africans were trying to pirate technology from Silicon Valley. So the FBI came out, and sooner or later they caught Bullock collecting information, and they put him under surveillance, and then they called him in and interrogated him, and Bullock says, yeah, absolutely, I'm helping the ADL, of course, we've been looking at the anti-apartheid people. And so what happened was the FBI then went to the San Francisco police, who are kind of, they're like cops in a lot of places. They're not bright. They're Irish or Italian. And the Irish cops didn't know that the Jews were so powerful in San Francisco and funded nearly every Democratic candidate from the governorship down to the Congress. And when the San Francisco police learned that their officer Gerard was illegally obtaining information from the Department of Motor Vehicles and the Post Office and other people and funneling it to the not only to the Israeli consulate or the Jewish organizations, but selling it to the South African intelligence. You know what the dumb Irish cops did? They went and got search warrants to go into the ADL offices in San Francisco and LA, and man, they showed up and they ran into a funny thing. The LA police thought it was a little strange. And it turned out that the Israelis for some years, or the ADL, has been funding 10 or 12 police officers a year. They buy them 2 weeks in Israel take them over there, buy them drinks and all other things that go with a 2-week stag visit to a foreign country, because they want to ingratiate themselves with police departments to give them information about people hostile to Israel, in return for which they'll tell the police when somebody desecrates a synagogue who it is. And that connection between the Israelis and the ADL, the Mossad, the ADL, and the police, even up to the level of the FBI, they'd start inviting the head of the FBI to dinners, and he'd tell us district directors cooperate with the ADL. They're really a fine group against bigotry and anti-Semitism. So you build up an agency and an organization with the capacity to destroy the careers of people, whether they were in politics or somebody like Audrey Shabazz running an education for school teachers, or an Ivor Davies, who was a history professor and was denied the most prestigious chair in Eastern European history because of their efforts. And that kind of situation, that kind of power, in this country, luckily, the pendulum swings back and forth. And when the pendulum swings one way to excess, as I believe it has in favor of the Jewish community, the Israeli lobby, sooner or later it'll swing back. And the important thing is never to accept what somebody says is the history, whether it was 10 years ago or 30 years ago or 50 years ago. Because the people that first try to write that history are people who want to give a message that is consistent with what their political views are. And if you've suffered 2,000 years of anti-Semitism, you can justify practically anything to preserve a Jewish state. Right or wrong, no matter what atrocities they may commit. The kidnapping of that guy, what was his name, Vanunu, their own nuclear guy, they put a football helmet on so he can't talk. I mean, this is not a free society. I'll close with one humorous incident you'll enjoy. I was outraged when the Israelis invaded Lebanon. The 1954 Arms Control Act requires that if a country to whom the U.S. gives arms uses those arms to invade a foreign country, we must, by law, cut off arms assistance to that country. Remember when Turkey invaded Cyprus, we cut off aid to Turkey, a NATO ally, we cut them off. So when the Israelis invaded Lebanon and they started using U.S. cluster bombs, which they had been under a treaty, we gave them a cluster bomb after the 73 war, and we gave it to them on 3 conditions. One, it's a terrible weapon. It drops out of a plane at about 1,000 feet. This big napalm-type canister blows apart, and maybe 200 bombs float out and scatter over 25 acres, and they're timed to go off every 5 minutes. First group goes off on a contact, next 5 minutes. And when the planes are gone, these things are lying around, and troops know enough to stay away from, but little kids come out, or women pick them up and get their hand blown off. They're a terrible, devastating weapon, and we insisted by treaty in 1973 that they would use them only if they were invaded by the armies of more than one country. In other words, they had been invaded by 2 countries to use a cluster bomb. They'd never use them in cities, and they would never use them in partisan warfare against irregular units. Only against regular troops, only if you're invaded, never in civilian areas. Well, a guy named Nick Timish, who later died rather mysteriously, reported they were using cluster bombs, and he came into my office in Washington and gave me some cluster bomb fragments. And I said, they're using cluster bombs. The Israeli government immediately denied it. They sent a guy over to the Knesset to debate me. But somebody always leaks in this world, and the State Department guys knew they were losing cluster bomb, knew they were violating a treaty. And the State Department guys had tenure. The Israeli lobby couldn't get them out of their jobs. They could make it difficult for them. So they kept saying, you're right, McCloskey, keep saying it. So I'm issuing speeches on the use of cluster bombs. Finally, the Israelis admitted that they'd been lying, that they violated the treaty, that they'd used the cluster bombs in southern Lebanon. Well, there was enough concern in the Congress that 6 of us went over in 1980, and we went to Syria, met with Assad, went to Jordan, met with the king, and then we went to Lebanon, met with the various Christian Maronites and the Shiites and the Druze. There's 4 participants in the government of Lebanon. Met with the Israelis. We had to stay up in the American residence because they'd blown up the embassy. And we went with Yasser Arafat in his bunker in West Beirut. I remember saying to the guy that was later killed, what was the president? He was a Maronite Christian. He was running for the presidency. This was in July. The Israeli bombs were strafing West Berlin. I asked him, or West Beirut. I asked him, how can you run for president? 1/6 of your country's down there in West Beirut getting bombed by the Israelis. Tanks, American bombs. And he said, that's not my problem, because to the Maronite Christian in Lebanon, the Muslims weren't really a problem. They were his problem. That was about 2 weeks before Shabra and Shatila, when the Israelis unleashed the militia into those camps and killed all the women and children. Well, anyway, after we had met with these various Arab leaders and went to Israel and Egypt, they put me up at the King David Hotel, the very hotel where Begin had blown it up at one time when they were fighting the British. And Tom Brokaw's show got on satellite television and said, would I go to the Israeli television and tell them what we were finding, talking to Assad, Hussein, Arafat. And I'll never forget it, because you get about a 5-minute soundbite, and Brokaw's in New York, and I'm in this Israeli television station up on a hilltop, and they say, what do you think of Begin? And I think, well, he's the same guy that hung the British soldiers back in the war. He was a terrorist then. Even the Israelis thought Begin was a terrorist. I think they called him the Jewish Hitler, I believe was the name they assigned to him. In any event, what do you think of Sharon? Well, he's a butcher, that guy. I mean, Sharon was a mean guy, and what was the third one? Shamir. Shamir was a little evil-looking guy. And so here I am over national television on Brokaw on NBC talking about the Israeli leaders, none of it complimentary. And Brokaw says, well, tell me, what do you think of Yasser Arafat? No, he quite met with Yasser Arafat at that time. I said, well, I think he's a man of peace. At that point, they shut off, the Israeli military center shut off the television program and broadcast the United States. And I'm walking out, I can hear the guy running the show, and he's arguing with the Brigadier General of the military censor. He said, you can't shut off an American, speaking over an American audience. And the Major General, or Brigadier, he says, we don't care what he says about our leaders. We probably agree with him. But nobody can say Yasser Arafat is not a terrorist on Israeli television. And that, of course, was the ADL position at the time, that Paul Finley lost his seat in Congress because he met with Yasser Arafat. Andy Young lost his seat at the UN because he had met with the PLO. So you've got this incredibly powerful organization. You remember, you all should have this tape if you don't, of that guy on the phone from New York to Washington. They're explaining how many people have been appointed from the ADL into the Clinton administration. It's enough to make you Republican. And that is true, incidentally. The Democrats are far more beholden to the Israeli lobby than Republicans. Republicans tend to get their money from big business, and that's sometimes corrupt, but you can't get elected in this state without the support of Jewish money if you're a Democrat and you want to be elected. Well, that power has, I think, reached its zenith. I hope you'll keep examining history. I've written 2 books on history. And it's very difficult to get at the truth when you go to the original sources. I would caution you against one thing, a little that I hear today. A historian should be dispassionate. I use that word deliberately. Do not let the conduct of your enemies cause you to become less than dispassionate in your historical view. I hate to hear the word propaganda. I've heard it ever since I've been a young man. Your story is the truth. The enemy's story is propaganda. It's unseemly, in my judgment, to say that one point of view is propaganda. The great American Constitution was probably enacted because of an 82-year American named Ben Franklin. On the last day of the Constitutional Convention, they labored 4.5 months in a sealed room in Philadelphia. They'd come out with a Constitution. When people say you're too old to be in the Congress, you just remind them of Franklin's speech. He's 82. And he got up and he said, gentlemen, he said, the older I grow, the more apt I am to doubt my own judgment, even on matters that I was once certain of, because when I received fuller information or new arguments, I found that I was often wrong in the opinions that I originally formed. A historian, ideally, should be like a juror in California. Every juror, before you're sworn, you have to advise the court that you will wait to hear all of the evidence on both sides of an issue before reaching a judgment of guilt or innocence or liability or non-liability. And I think to the historian particularly, dispassionate reporting of events. Because the other side say you're a kook or a screwball or a nut, don't be led into saying they're a vicious tool of the Israeli state. They may be, but the historian's words receive the credit of the community, maybe not at the first. Maybe you're reviled. The first guy that said something about being the Son of God, didn't they crucify him? I mean, the messenger is always shot. It's customary. The first person who spoke out against Vietnam War, most of my district thought I was a communist. I got away with it because I'd been a Marine in Korea. They couldn't really say a Marine was not patriotic. But if a college professor said he was against the war, I remember my colleagues in the Congress saying they're traitors. Well, the great source of inquiry ought to be the college campus. The minds of students with instructors that put both issues before them. When I was a freshman at Stanford, the rednecks and the right-wingers in Southern California wanted to get rid of a Stanford economic professor because he was a communist. He taught socialism, Ted Krebs. And everybody said, get rid of Krebs. How can young minds be exposed to this terrible man saying that there's something other than capitalism to look at as a goal? The man that is revered in the Marine Corps, Smedley Butler, fought in every island, Santo Domingo, Haiti, Nicaragua. He fought for 30 years. When he retired, they asked him, tell me about your career, General Butler. He said, well, you know, in my youth, I thought I was fighting for the freedom of the peasant and justice and dignity and truth for Latin Americans. I now realize that I was fighting for the Anaconda Copper and the United Fruit Companies. And that history, of course, in that time, if you had suggested that Marines were dying in Nicaragua or Haiti for United Fruit Company, you would have had the same public opinion turn against U.S. intervention in Latin America as you saw in Vietnam. You know what turned the Vietnam public opinion? Was Tet. Tet was a terrible defeat for the communist insurgency. Practically wiped out the Viet Cong. But Tet taught the American people that our government had been lying to us for over 4 years, that we weren't winning the war, that these people were not being wiped out, that they had the capacity to fight. And so when the people learn the truth, they turn against those that have been lying to them for these many years. And I think if the movement of which you people are the striking edge can retain dispassion in the face of these outrages, like being in prison in Germany for thinking, it's like going back to the Alien and Sedition Acts. That's what this country was formed to allow, is to allow people to criticize government, like John Peter Zenger. Only now you're criticizing worse than the government of the United States. You're threatening the security of the state of Israel that the Jewish community is dedicated to preserve and to destroy those who speak against it. Good luck.